Hey friendarinos, it's Chris. Today I want to talk about something that has occupied way too much space in my brain for way too long. First, let's talk art though. I said just last video that my sketch process is boring and dumb, but yeah, I tried recording it and turns out it is actually kind of cool to watch. At least I think so. And you can really see in this too exactly what I was talking about in the last video about how my sketch process involves so many layers of prep and so many layers of building up the sketch before I even start the line art. I didn't even bother recording the first and, in my opinion, most boring part. That's just like me moving circles around until I roughly know where bodies are going to be existing. I start with the slightly more detailed sketch in this one and then move on to the line art. And I did do, as you'll see, an intensive hand surgery at one point too, but that also seemed like something that didn't need to be recorded because it was really just like watching me lose my mind in real time, and that's between me and God. But a final note on the art before we get into the meat of things. Two final notes, actually, of varying levels of importance. This is a commission I had a lot of fun with. If you're interested in my work, want to just come say hi, want to see me draw some pretty anime boys, come check me out on Instagram. I'll have the link in the description below. Boy, I hope that's not a sign of how this recording is going to go tonight. But yeah, I'll have my Instagram in the description. Come say hi to me. Come talk to me about a commission if that interests you. I have my pricing up there too. The last extremely important thing I want to mention art-wise is look at Dimitri's belt. This is one of my favorite things I've seen in character design in recent memory. That belt serves absolutely no practical or decorative purpose other than just making Dimitri's whole armor getup look less like a mecha. Take a look at his design at some point. It's the most hilariously ineffective belt I've ever seen on any person. Okay, so let's talk Fire Emblem character writing. I, like many people, feel like Fire Emblem Three Houses has some of the most successful, consistent, and nuanced character writing that not only this series, but modern gaming as a whole has really seen. Not perfect, of course, but the level of consideration that was put into really deep characterization for every single character in a fairly large cast, I think, is worth noting at the very least. But to talk about why the character writing in Three Houses does work so successfully, I first want to address why I believe it completely doesn't work in Fire Emblem Fates. I don't actually know anymore how hot of a take that is. I don't know where the fandom is at with their feelings about Fates right now. When it first came out, I think there was, of course, the usual hype about everybody choosing their waifus and whatnot. And of course, Camilla has 6 different alts in the mobile game at this point now. But I know there's also been a ton of backlash, in my opinion, justified backlash about hey, pretty weird that about half of the possible marriage options are people who either are your siblings or you believe to be your siblings for a good portion of your upbringing. What do we gotta say about that? Among a few other things, but I'm not here to talk about that. I want to talk about just the character writing in Fates at the very base level, just the trends that I've found that permeate throughout how every character is written. There is kind of a formula to it, honestly. I know that a lot of this is going to sound very uncharitable, and I want you to believe I'm critical because I love Fire Emblem as a series, but I do think that Fates was essentially the low point in terms of character writing in the modern era of Fire Emblem games. So I'm harsh because I love this series. So Fates, their formula, they like to do this thing where most of the conversations involve one character who's the quirky and zany one and the other one who's kind of relegated to being a straight man. So there's kind of an active party and a receptive party in most conversations. This way, only one key personality trait really needs to be managed at any given time. They can pretty much just focus on the one trait by the very quirky character in the conversation that's going to act as the axis around which everything else turns for the duration of that interaction, and frequently for the duration of the entire support chain between those two characters. So to illustrate what I'm talking about with this formula, first let's talk about Felicia. I mostly chose her because she's somebody who, if you're playing as the male avatar anyway, she is ever present throughout the entirety of the game, so she's given plenty of time to be fleshed out She's not just some random side character. She's not like a filler in case you let somebody important die early in the game, right? So I took a look at her support. She has about 20 of them if you're not counting anybody who could possibly be her child. So out of roughly 20 of her main supports, only 3 or 4 of them didn't largely focus on her just being a clumsy, adorkable dingus within the first conversation. And like having a clumsy character is fine, but anybody who was into reading fan fiction in 2008 will tell you that clumsiness is the flaw that isn't actually a flaw. Clumsiness is the flaw that you give to someone who you want to be just so irritatingly likable, so insufferably perfect, and then you can point out clumsiness and be like, see, she has things going on. She's not perfect. My nitpicking about that aside, so that tends to be when I mention the formula that Fates use. Her clumsiness is the key quirk that her support conversations will all rotate around. And then every interaction with the other characters that she has will result in the other character either scolding her or consoling her, depending on the basics of the archetype that character embodies. There are a couple exceptions, of course. In particular, her support with Azuma? Whatever. Her support with him was pretty interesting because he actually approached and asked her something about what it's like to really dedicate yourself to service to somebody else. And that's promising. That shows some promise for a little bit of character depth, exchanging personal beliefs and whatnot. But then in their second conversation, they're immediately right back to just her being a clumsy idiot. So, I mean, it's short-lived. If they're not relying on just one key quirk to be the cornerstone of the entire interaction, generally the conversation is just this sort of string of word salad generated from an external situation of some kind. So for this one, I looked into a lot of the supports from Fates because I couldn't be damned to remember all of the dialogue and conversation from a game that I played through in its entirety 3 times, by the way. What does that tell you? That I remember so little about this game. I couldn't remember who I married in each playthrough until I stared fixatedly at a character list for a little while. But anyway... Camilla and Ryoma, they are both main characters. I really wanted to intentionally choose characters who would have had all the time in the world to be developed in this game. They're put together and they discover in their first conversation that they don't actually have anything in common. And I think that's a great starting point. There's so much promise there. They could spend time teaching the other person about an interest or trading cultural knowledge or what have you. There are so many good possibilities with that seemingly kind of awkward starting point. Instead, they end up arguing over who knows the main character better, which is, I know cringe culture is dead, but this I think just resuscitated it. And never mind the fact that Ryoma has no earthly reason to believe that he knows Corin better than Camilla does. Corin, the main character, grew up with Camilla as a sibling and just met Ryoma a couple weeks ago in-game, depending on when this conversation takes place in your playthrough. And he's also never been shown to be this petty with other people. There's no precedent for this behavior for him. And then as you continue the support chain, none of their dialogue feels unique to either character. We learn absolutely nothing new about either of them. Like I said, the closest we get to something of substance here is in the base premise that we start at. And then, if you choose to marry them off together, Ryoma wanders up to Camilla at one point and alludes to them having had all kinds of meaningful discussions off-screen, and then proposes to her on the grounds that Camilla is, quote, beautiful and kind, and she tepidly agrees. What a fairy tale romance. And, Fates does this, lots of conversations happened off-screen stuff all the time. It's infuriating. It's fine and reasonable to imply that characters have interactions that we don't see, but Fates implies that the meaningful conversations that genuinely bring the characters closer are the ones that we're not privy to. Somehow, between, I know this person better than you do, no you don't, yes I do, and please marry me, There was apparently a lot happened, but boy howdy, they're not going to share that with the class. And there are tons of other examples of this kind of thing and this formulaic way of writing in Fates. One of the other ones I took a look at was Nyx and Tsubaki. She doesn't want to socialize, which it hints at this resentment for Hoshidans and this long dark past, which is great. We get a little taste of something interesting there, but that's only in the first conversation they have. Other than that, for some not really discussed reason, Tsubaki really wants to get to know this specific scantily clad, actually much older than she looks lolly. So he learns how to make coffee to get her to talk to him, and it works. And that's it. And we learn nothing new about either of those characters whatsoever. So really the conclusion that I ended up coming to after spending some time milling through these very samey support conversations was that Fire Emblem Fates substitutes eccentricity and quirk for depth and inconsistency for nuance. That's why the closest you'll find to a really interesting, substantial conversation is when they slap two really eccentric characters into each other, so they at least have material to work with and no one is just put in the corner as the straight man. But really, by and large, it's all pretty archetypical. Effie eats a lot and is strong, Tsubaki is perfect at everything, Kaze is handsome and also nice, and it's pretty much all like that. So, now that I've really pissed off everybody whose first Fire Emblem game was Fates, I'm sorry, listen, I started with the Tellius games, alright? I'm an old fart and I have certain standards in place. But Three Houses. The key thing that Three Houses character writing does differently from Fates, that really sets its character writing apart, is that every single thing that a character says at every moment is colored by that character's entire history. If you shuffled the dialogue from one character to another, it would feel noticeably off, and not just because you put one archetype on a different character design that doesn't quite fit, but because the whole voice and tone is different. And I mean like written voice. I'm not talking about the voice acting, because the voice acting in that game is generally phenomenal and does also give it a serious advantage. That's actually why when I was reviewing for this video, I read these supports instead of watching them, because I wanted to be able to process them kind of on the same level as Fates. But every support conversation in Three Houses comes to the table with its own two fully realized people. Two childhoods, two sets of political and religious beliefs, two developed personalities informed by this whole lifetime of experiences that has logically built up to who that person is at the moment that we meet them. And because I am not about to be the person who tries to decide which of Three Houses characters are best written, that's not a fight I'm about to get into today. Instead, let's just talk about Felix, because he was one of my first faves in this game. I want to use Felix as a sort of case study to break down the strengths and the particular methods behind the character writing in Three Houses as a whole. Part of why I chose Felix is because he could very easily be just another name on the extensive list of edgy sword guys in Fire Emblem's history. There's at least one or two in every game, but the nuance of his personality is clear in all of his supports and in his place in the larger narrative. Just from the start, his supports take a notably different tone depending on whether who he's talking to has any sort of connection to his past or a pre-existing relationship with him or his family or not. And if they do, he tends to just wander up and antagonize them. He'll go up and he'll antagonize somebody, and that'll prompt some discussion of their shared history and how each character copes with both the past and their present circumstances and their views moving forward. And if they don't have a shared history already, which are some of my personal favorites with Felix, honestly, it really shows a totally different side of him. He's notably warmer on the approach with those people, right? So with Annette and Mercedes and Seteth, it's kicked off with Felix approaching at least more willing to give the other person benefit of the doubt. He hasn't already put them in his brain as being this troublesome, painful part of his past. This alone, just the difference in approach switch between different types of people is so much more nuanced than you would see in any Fates character. But moving forward, every outward trait of his, even the ones that you would kind of just expect with his archetype, like I said, the edgy sword guy, even those make sense and can be directly tied back to a source in his psychology or upbringing or personal experiences. None of his words or actions happen just because he's like that, I guess. His moods and outbursts, other than just being there because they're sort of obligatory for the type of character he's meant to be, instead they're generally tied to a specific triggering event or a phrase of some kind or some sort of attitude or emotion that he's picked up from the other person. He has strong beliefs and reacts according to them. Multiple strong beliefs, honestly. Beliefs that can't just be summed up in a single sentence. And that's true for every character in this game, just about. So if he's acting like the grumpy Sasuke of the group, it's because he hasn't been given space to properly mourn his brother because of everyone else's feelings on the matter. So of course, even just thinking of it through that lens, a lot of his interactions with other people, both regarding his brother and regarding his family at large and regarding the concept of death, so much can already be tied back to just this fact, the fact that his own emotional growth has been stunted and smothered by the reactions that everyone else around him has had and the environment that he's had to try to work all of this out inside of. And perhaps because of that, he actually almost never willingly brings up Glenn on his own unless prompted. And when he does, such as with Ingrid's support, he's frequently just shut down as a result. So of course that's going to deter him from opening up about that in the future. And again, we can follow that thread to other aspects of his characterization. Now, on reflecting on all of this, he feels that he's part of a system that is just this conveyor belt towards an untimely death. And the people closest to him seem astonishingly okay with this, even idolizing it. Everyone sees him as the weird one for not being super into the idea of throwing himself into potential death at a moment's notice because somebody else told him to and it's his job. And because of all of this, it's caused this breakdown in connection and communication between him and his peers, causing him to kind of turn inward and, like I said, stunting his emotional growth. His personal history created the person that we meet in-game. And heck, even the times when he's very much not being edgy sword guy, his more unusual interactions follow this logic perfectly as well. When he's caught off guard in conversation and made to express himself in a way that he hasn't rehearsed at all, he completely fumbles the delivery. Like, when he's talking about beliefs he's clearly reflected on, he's actually quite eloquent. You know, he's still a noble. He had that education, but we'll get back to that later. He says to Sedith in their support conversations, which I just love, he says, "Chivalry begets the worship and glorification of death. Am I alone in finding that grotesque?" Which, it sounds theatrical, it sounds intellectual, it sounds rehearsed, but when he tries to tell a cute girl that he likes hearing her sing, he just like stumbles around the words like an idiot. He tries to tell Dedue that he doesn't actually want him to die. That's a conclusion that takes him some time to reach. But he says, you know, "If you die, I'll kill you." And Dedue reasonably is like, okay? And Felix is just completely unprepared to elaborate on that sentiment whatsoever when pushed. It makes sense. He was never given a space where he could have these more organic, natural conversations because he's working on so many things that have stuffed him in this edgy little box of emotion. And then you can see all of this care and consistency put into his characterization, backing up his place in the larger narrative, too. This is kind of a little bit of a headcanon, a little bit of a personal theory, but in my opinion, by all accounts, it would make more sense from a political standpoint for Felix to be the kind of second in command in the Blue Lions instead of Dedue, because of his family's long-established, intimate personal service to the crown. Like, this is something that's that's been generational for him, right? But because of his unique relationship and history with Dimitri, that assumed social order is disrupted and sort of shuffled around and reordered. Similar to this, again, relating to his personal history with Dimitri, there's a reason why Felix is the only person in the Azure Moon route of the story who openly calls out Dimitri for being a feral psychopath. And this, by the way, was a segment that I started calling "Why Are You Booing Felix? He's Right," because I'm sitting there playing Azure Moon and being like, why are we following this man? I am worried about the potentially fatal results of following his very chaotic and very murderous whims. But Felix walks up and is like, hey, we've all lost family members. Because I think actually one of his callouts in particular happens right after Felix's own father dies for Dimitri. So Felix is just as alone in the world as Dimitri, and Dimitri himself could easily be seen as the reason why. I'm not saying that's necessarily the case from an objective standpoint, but it would be understandable if Felix or any other person saw it that way. And even in the school phase, Dimitri reminisces about hunting trips with Felix's dad, Rodrigue, but like, where was Felix during those trips? It kind of sounds like in some ways Rodrigue fathered Dimitri more than his actual son, especially after Glenn's passing. So this would mean that Felix and Dimitri, more than just growing up together, would have been treated as sort of adoptive brothers in their youth. And it would give Felix this greater sense of familiarity with Dimitri and would sort of justify his desire, or at least explain his desire to call out what he sees as destructive and unjustified behavior. So at this point, knowing everything that we know about him, everything we know about his history with Dimitri and his psychology, it's not just that Felix can be used as a plot device to challenge Dimitri and further a conversation or a conflict. It's that because of what we know about him, he has to confront Dimitri. It wouldn't make sense for him not to. So I hope that sort of all makes sense. This idea that Felix, as an example, but in truth, pretty much every character, or at least every main character, every playable character in the game, is a construct of life experiences coming together to inform everything that that person says and does. Hey, like real people. So the other thing, there are actually two more techniques. If I were a real internet person, I would make this a numbered list, but this is the second of, I would say, 3 total techniques that Three Houses uses to really flesh out its character writing. And this is what I've been thinking of as negative space. In art, negative space can basically be thought of as the gaps or the empty areas in a composition. It's basically the space between and around objects. A successful artistic composition will utilize negative space to direct your eye and guide you and inform the viewer in subtle and almost subconscious ways towards the elements of the art piece that the artist wants to place emphasis on. In writing, this can basically be thought of similarly to the show don't tell rule. Felix never explicitly says that he carries any resentment toward Dimitri for his more positive, more nurturing relationship with Rodrigue. He never says outright that he would resent Ingrid telling him to act like a proper heir to his family, when if his older brother had been alive, he wouldn't even be the heir. He's the second son. And he never says outright that he loves music or appreciates singing or people who can sing, but it's obvious through his supports with Annette and Dorothea, which goes overlooked, but it's a lovely support chain. Those make it clear that he has a soft spot for music. These elements of Felix's character can be seen as the negative space, the gaps that draw our eye and help flesh him out. They're guiding our perception of him without cluttering the, I guess we could call it the composition of how he's written. And then the last technique that I find that Three Houses uses very effectively is character voice. And again, I'm not talking about voice acting, but character voice in terms of written voice is one of the greatest pitfalls in Fates and one of the greatest strengths in Three Houses. So this refers to the exact words and phrases that a character would use to express a point. That's actually what I was alluding to when I mentioned a little bit earlier that Felix is very eloquent in certain situations. The specific wording he uses is that of a person who has been afforded an education. When Felix says, chivalry begets the worship and glorification of death, another character who is a commoner, maybe like Cyril or Raphael, they might phrase that sentiment as, oh, knights talk about death like it's some big goal to strive towards, right? The exact wording is different. And this is true of every single character. Seteth and Flayn have notably antiquated ways of speaking. This is why Flayn is the only valid 1,000-year-old girl, by the way. Fight me about that. Fire Emblem really loves its little girls who are actually 1,000 years old, and Flayn is the only well-written one. They sound like people who have had the kind of life experiences that they have had, Seteth and Flayn. They both sound like they come from another time when you really pay attention to the minutia. Lorenz and Ferdinand actually seem that, well, they do have a lot in common. They both pride themselves in their noble upbringing, but even they have distinct speech patterns that are different from one another. Because of the cultures that they come from, Lorenz generally speaks like a politician, and Ferdinand speaks more like a fairy tale knight. They still have their own flavors in the exact wording they use. So character voice is the biggest reason why you couldn't just shuffle around dialogue in this game to any character. It gives a sense of tangible personal identity to every person. And you know, the results are hard to argue with. One of the main selling points for Fire Emblem as a whole, but especially Three Houses, is that everyone is someone's fave. Everyone is going to meet these characters on their own terms, depending on who they are in their own real-life personal experience. In that way, it is like meeting another person and getting to know them. That's pretty much all I had in mind, I guess. I love character writing. I'm kind of obsessed with it, honestly. I don't know if I've ever loved a piece of media if I didn't love the characters in it. Sort of on that train of thought, moving forward, I am going to have a lot to say about our two main characters, our main lords in the drawing here in my commission, because I have been thinking a lot about the Crimson Flower route in this game, and specifically how to fix it. So look forward to that. But yeah, the more time goes on, the more I've started thinking that Three Houses is really the story of an incredibly solid cast of characters trapped in a deeply flawed and tragically messy plot. But we'll get to that. Thank you for joining me for another edition of I Like Things Too Much and have allotted too much of my mental real estate to the internal lives of beautiful anime people. Come talk to me on Insta if you want to see more of my art and more of my shit posting and more of my pretty anime boys. Bye!